Kim was looking at old photos in the family album while talking to her mother. Her speech had notes of dissatisfaction. I just can't figure out who I look more like. Appearance-wise, everything is definite, but when it comes to my life path, I still don't have a clear vision of my future. My grandma worked as the head of a department at a medical school for many years. My grandpa was a scientific researcher, and my dad works as the chief engineer at a factory. Putting the photo album aside, Kim added, "And you, Mum, are a teacher. So, why am I working as a nominal designer in a dumpy workshop, and my boss never listened to me? It's not just that I have no plans for advancement, but the director is always picking on me. I have so many interesting ideas in my head, and I'm sure they would help improve the quality of production to a higher level. But the boss doesn't want to hear anything. He doesn't like initiative people. They seem too smart to him." Miranda sat next to her daughter, ran her hand through her hair, and said, "You know, before becoming head of department, your grandmother worked for a long time as a regular laboratory assistant. She was noticed and offered a promotion. The same with Grandpa. He didn't immediately become a famous scientific researcher. And your father, that's a whole separate topic. He started from the bottom, first as a regular fitter, then worked his way up to mechanic, and now he's the chief engineer. But you, Mum, managed to climb the career ladder in one breath. So what should I do with this atelier?" Miranda walked over to the window and asked her daughter to come to her. "Honey, pay attention to how the children play in the playground. They have a united team and all repeat the same manipulations. And if someone does it better, the children immediately adopt the experience of their neighbour." But Kim didn't quite understand the meaning of this reasoning. "Mum, let's keep it simple, without psychological tricks. Sometimes it's hard to understand you." Not to delve too deeply into the thought, the mother summed up, "Children just have a sense of unity, and it lasts a long time. Your director is an egoist, and he no longer has such notions as working together in a coordinated team. He is satisfied with the result, as long as it brings in some money, and improving the result doesn't interest him at all." Her mother was still saying something, but Kim wasn't listening to her anymore, thinking over her conclusions. She decided that if she was a good professional and not appreciated, she would not try to impose and knock on a closed door, and just continue to work as an ordinary seamstress. But if a better option presented itself, she wouldn't miss it. She was distracted from her thoughts by her father, who had returned from work. "Hello, my dears. This weekend we're going to our friends. They invited us to organise a picnic together. I think it's not a bad idea, especially since we haven't been in nature for a long time." Miranda gestured to her daughter that they could continue the conversation later. "Of course, dear. I fully support your idea." Kim had no other plans for the weekend, so she agreed to come with them too. The next day, the girl arrived at the atelier a little earlier than usual and didn't immediately go to her workplace. She wanted to talk to Mr. Brady, her boss, once again. Even after talking to her mother and receiving hints about unity, Kim still hoped to show initiative. The owner of the atelier arrived later than usual, and seeing Kim at the threshold of his office, asked, "What are you doing here? If it's about money, the salary was paid last week, and don't expect any advance payment. You haven't earned it yet." These words offended Kim, but she held back to avoid saying anything unnecessary. No, Mr. Brady. I'm here not because of money. I just thought we could use the ideas I mentioned last time. I think the atelier will only benefit from it." Mr. Brady frowned and replied, "I know what we need, and your original ideas don't interest me at all. By the way, I am a technologist by education, so you don't need to teach your director." It was another frustrating remark that Kim also endured. She wasn't used to swearing. "Well, okay, Mr. Brady, you know best. Sorry for taking your precious time." And she silently sat down at her workplace. Throughout the day, Kim tried not to look at anyone. She understood that people were gossiping behind her back, but she had immunity for such cases. Her grandmother often took her to medical school, and there, when she spoke to the audience, she sat her granddaughter next to her, as if a faithful assistant. So Kim had been long accustomed to being the centre of attention. Remembering this, Kim drove away the gloomy thoughts. The end of the working day was approaching. Everyone began to gather, but suddenly a woman flew into the atelier like a meteor. She was wearing expensive clothes and had several exquisite gold rings on her fingers. Moreover, a gorgeous bracelet made of precious metal adorned her left wrist. Kim thought this was another boss's girlfriend, but no, when Mr. Brady came to her, she began to scold and shout at him in front of everyone. "I asked you not to skimp on the material. Don't you understand me at all? I'll punish you once with money, then you'll understand that this is no joke." After this, thoughts of a girlfriend fell off by themselves. Kim guessed that this woman was a regular and very valuable client. At least, she knew Mr. Brady well enough to allow such eccentric outbursts. Mr. Brady lowered his head like a guilty schoolboy. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hobbs, I'll fix everything. The thing is, I'm catastrophically short of qualified specialists," excused the director, and took the client to his office. What a crafty fox he is. Kim puffed up her cheeks with anger. "He says there are no good employees, but he rejected all my suggestions. I need to remind him of this again." In addition to her thoughts on another conversation with the director, Kim suddenly realized that the client was not so simple. Despite her behavior, she was full of dignity and confidence in their rightness. It was clear that the woman, Mrs. Hobbs, knew exactly what she could demand and when it was better to keep quiet. And she was probably an excellent clothing designer. Judging by her stylish appearance and expensive jewellery, she was at least the owner of a modelling agency. Most likely, Kim would be able to come to an agreement with her by offering original ideas. After 20 minutes, Mrs. Hobbs left Mr. Brady's office. He looked out after her, and his face was a deep shade of red, and sweat was pouring down his forehead. Apparently, it was hard for him to endure all of her reproaches and criticisms. Turning her head, as if examining new possessions, Mrs. Hobbs left the studio. Just in case, Kim looked to see what car she had come in. An expensive black fancy car was parked in the yard. It was clear that the woman was wealthy. In her thoughts, Kim was already looking forward to presenting her new clothing samples to her, but these were just dreams. When she got home, she decided to consult her mother. "So what do you think, Mum? Am I doing the right thing if I show initiative to her?" Miranda crossed her hands on her lap and replied, "I wouldn't rush to make hasty decisions. You yourself said that your director doesn't like initiative people. But what if you ended up being the fall guy? On the other hand, he who does not risk does not drink champagne." Kim took note of her mother's warning, but she still wanted to test her persistence in action. There was silence in the atelier for almost a week. The wealthy client did not appear, and Mr. Brady looked darker than a cloud. He felt as if he was driven into a certain framework and was not at rest. And although he knew perfectly well that Kim could become his indispensable assistant, he used to do everything as he saw fit and refused any new ideas. Kim had already decided that Mrs. Hobbs would not visit them again, but on Monday morning, the woman visited once again. After a wonderful weekend with her family at a picnic, Kim did not really want to spoil her mood. However, curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to approach Mrs. Hobbs. The woman was trying to figure something out from Mr. Brady near the racks of clothes. "When have you been asked to send an order?" "Did you listen to me, Mr. Brady? Maybe it's time to pay you less or even change the atelier. Sorry, but my sales deadlines are being missed, and I really don't want to be embarrassed in front of serious people later. In general, correct your mistakes, and finally, find a good designer." The cherished word for Kim was spoken. She flew towards Mrs. Hobbs like a bird, but stopped abruptly halfway. At that moment, the woman took one of the finished items in her hands. "And what's this? Whose hands did this mess come from? What kind of incompetent people are working for you here? Mr. Brady, why are you silent? Answer." Kim saw that Mrs. Hobbs was holding the dress she had been working on for a long time. Her mind became cloudy, and instead of finding out what Mrs. Hobbs didn't like about the dress, Kim blurted out, "How dare you judge a person just by looking at their work? This dress is my creation, and I don't think there are any flaws in it." Kim was on the edge and wanted to continue, but to defuse the situation, Mr. Brady firmly grabbed her elbow and led her to his office. Before climbing the stairs, the woman discreetly put Kim's dress in her purse and shouted, "Don't overdo it, Mr. Brady. I'll come back to you later." Kim didn't understand what this could mean, but there was no time to think on distracted topics, because a serious conversation with the boss was ahead of her. Half an hour later, Kim was standing in front of her boss. Mr. Brady started without closing the door. "Do you realize who you're dealing with? You just insulted a wealthy client. I'm already walking on eggshells in front of her, and you've created a scene. So, you're fired, and I don't want to see you here again. And, by the way, I don't think you'll get a job in another atelier. I'll make sure that you never get a job as designer in our city." Kim left the office and only then started crying. She didn't want the director to see her tears and make fun of her even more. An hour later, she was home. "Mum, I got fired, just like you warned me. I should have stayed out of it with my advice, and why don't I ever listen to you?" Miranda approached her daughter and hugged her. "Don't worry, my dear. This isn't the last atelier in the area. There are many firms where your abilities can be useful. You'll see that fate will give you a second chance." Kim weakly believed in these comforting words and started looking for a new job the next day. She was ashamed to look at her parents in the eye. Her father had been working in the same place for 20 years, and her mother was constantly dealing with clients, and only their daughter had shown herself in a bad light. The director dismissed her out of the atelier with a paltry severance pay, and on parting, he sarcastically said, "Have a good trip, but not silk, but with spools, so you can collect all the bumps." Kim went to interviews all week, but was rejected everywhere. Interestingly enough, they didn't explain the reason for the refusal, and the girls suspected that Mr. Brady was behind it. Mrs. Hobbs probably had a hand in it too. In any case, Kim had no other theories yet. But she had no intention of going to the former director, though she still wanted to settle the score with Mrs. Hobbs. However, Kim didn't know where to find her. While thinking about how to compensate for her losses, Kim suddenly came up with the idea that she really wanted to get back at Mrs. Hobbs. But it was out of the question because revenge doesn't justify bad deeds. In addition, Kim's mother advised her to forget this misunderstanding and move on with her life. Soon, Kim was able to find remote work, creating clothing patterns for a capital atelier. Although it wasn't much of an income, now it was better than nothing. 3 weeks had passed since she quit. Mr. Brady sometimes saw her in the city, but he didn't approach her. One day, a familiar black car pulled up to Kim's house. The girl looked out the window and almost screamed. "It's Mrs. Hobbs herself! Who has arrived?" "She wants to humiliate me here too. Well, now I'll tell her what I think of her." Running out into the street, Kim ran up to the car and kicked the tire, shouting, "Why did you come here? Isn't my shame in front of the atelier director enough for you? I was fired because of it, and now you want to trample me here too?" In response, Mrs. Hobbs handed her the very dress she had rejected before. "This is your work as far as I remember, and I'm not going to humiliate you, Kim. On the contrary, I would like to offer you a job as a designer in my company. As you may have guessed, I own a private modelling agency. I work only with wealthy and successful people in our city and neighbouring regions, a very narrow circle of clients. Also, I have a network of stores for selling clothing, tailoring and repair. And in Mr. Brady's atelier, I am a co-founder. But because of my workload in my main line of work, I never strictly monitored his work. And if you want to be my right-hand person, then welcome aboard." Kim's joy was boundless, and she instantly forgot that a moment ago she had been furious with Mrs. Hobbs. "I am flattered by your offer, but what about the dress that you rejected? I had been working on it for a whole week." Mrs. Hobbs smiled and said, "You rushed to conclusions when you attacked me. At that moment, I wanted to scold Mr. Brady for his careless attitude towards our partnership, and your work fell into my hands. But in reality, I really liked your dress, and I got curious who created such a masterpiece. That's why I am here with a job offer." Here, Kim felt her cheeks turning red. "I'm sorry, but my emotions overwhelmed me. By the way, what about the atelier? If Mr. Brady finds out that I've joined you, he won't let me work in peace." Mrs. Hobbs looked at the girl meaningfully and replied, "You'll see everything tomorrow. I haven't told you the main thing yet, but that's later. I'll pick you up tomorrow morning." Surprisingly, the black car was parked outside the house again at 8 o'clock in the morning. With alarm and nervous excitement, Kim got into the car. Together, they arrived at the modelling agency. The first introduction to the staff was successful. "Well, there's nothing to worry about. You were accepted normally. Now, I'll show you your office." Kim could only dream of such a thing. A separate workplace, and even a view from the window of the business centre was simply wonderful. For 2 hours, Mrs. Hobbs explained the intricacies of working at the agency to Kim. A little later, they got back in the car, and Mrs. Hobbs said, "And now, let's go visit Mr. Brady. I think he will be happy to see a new business partner. By the way, you look great. Did you make the suit yourself or buy it?" "I designed it, and then the tailor sewed it to my specifications." Half an hour later, they arrived at the atelier. "Come in, you won't get lost here. It hasn't been that long since you were fired," Mrs. Hobbs joked. Mr. Brady was shocked when Mrs. Hobbs introduced him to her new protégé. Kim would supervise all orders from now on. "And look, Mr. Brady, she won't let you off the hook. I put up with you, but I think Kim will put you in your place quickly. I know what she's capable of." The director suddenly turned red and retreated to his office. On the way, he told Kim about the successes they had achieved in the last month. The figures were not that impressive, but Kim firmly stated, that she would put things in order. After that, Mr. Brady did not accept any orders without her approval. Sometimes Kim remembered her mother's words about unity and told herself mentally, not all people behave arrogantly when in charge. And she was right, because Mrs. Hobbs never spoke to her as if Kim were not an employee, but rather the company's property. Thank you for listening, and have a nice day.